Every night, he swept floors under flickering lights, invisible to the world, just another gas station worker on the edge of town, until one quiet act of kindness changed everything. He gave a sandwich and a jacket to a man eating from the trash. By morning, military vehicles surrounded his store, and his name was echoing through government offices. Who was the man he helped? And why did a decorated general salute a fired cashier in front of the nation? This isn't a story about rules. It's a story about what happens when you choose to see someone no one else does. Now, let me tell you what happened that night. James Dawson was 27 and mostly invisible. Every night, under the sickly blue glow of the fluorescent lights at the quick-stop gas station on the edge of Tampa, Florida, he went about his shift like clockwork, restocking shelves, mopping the sticky tile floors, checking the expiration dates on bottled orange juice that no one ever bought. The silence between midnight and dawn was his companion, and the quiet hum of the freezers was often the loudest thing in his world. He wasn't supposed to be here. Once, not long ago, James had been a promising journalism student at the University of South Florida. He carried a 3.8 GPA while juggling 2 part-time jobs, barista by morning and campus library clerk by night. He dreamed of becoming a foreign correspondent, telling stories that mattered from places most people would never go. Words had always been his weapon and his refuge. But life has a brutal way of tearing up blueprints. His mother's diagnosis came like a thunderclap on a clear day. Ovarian cancer, aggressive, late stage. Within months, the bright future James had painstakingly built was traded for hospital waiting rooms, medication schedules, and hospice care. He missed too many classes, the scholarship funding ran out. He withdrew from the university quietly, promising himself he'd return someday. That promise began to feel more like a fantasy with each passing year. When she passed away, James felt something inside him dim permanently. Grief became routine. He drifted from job to job, dishwasher, rideshare driver, janitor, each one a reminder of how far he'd fallen from who he thought he'd become. The quick stop wasn't glamorous, but it paid on time. It was clean and predictable. And at night, no one expected anything from him. His co-workers described him as quiet but solid. He never caused trouble, covered shifts without complaint, didn't gossip, didn't get involved. Not a doormat, but a man who had simply learned to pick his battles. Somewhere along the way, James stopped speaking dreams out loud. When customers asked if he was in school, he'd just shake his head, not anymore. Yet there were flickers. Moments when he'd linger over a newspaper article in the break room, when he'd reread pages from old notebooks stuffed in his locker, full of half-written stories and travel plans he'd once been sure he'd make real. Most nights, James stood alone behind the counter, sipping bad coffee from a chipped mug, watching the security monitors flicker in black and white. It wasn't much of a life, but it was quiet, safe. In a world where everything had fallen apart, at least he still had a place to stand. What he didn't know, what no one could have known, was that within 48 hours, a quiet choice he would make would explode into something that would not only shatter that routine, but alter the trajectory of his life forever. It was just past 1:17 a.m. on a Thursday when James stepped outside to take out the trash. The Tampa air was unusually crisp for late spring, tinged with the faint metallic scent of rain that never came. The dumpster sat in its usual spot behind the building, hidden from street view, half swallowed in shadows. That's when he saw him, a figure, slumped beside the dumpster, barely more than a silhouette at first. As James approached, the overhead security light revealed a man well into his 60s, maybe older, his long gray beard tangled, clothes layered and torn, his shoes held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. The man's hands, thin and shaking, fumbled with a crumpled plastic bread bag he must have pulled from the trash. James stopped mid-step, heart clenched. The man wasn't begging. He wasn't holding a sign or asking for help. He was simply trying to open a salvaged meal, struggling with brittle fingers to get to stale bread that even the trash had nearly rejected. For a moment, James just stood there. He knew the policy. Everyone who worked at Quick Stop did. The manager, Perry Stevens, had made it clear from day one. No freebies, no handouts, no exceptions. You feed one and 10 more show up. That's how it starts. Last year, Perry fired an employee for giving a granola bar to a woman living out of her car. "We're not a shelter," he'd said. "We're a business." But this wasn't a handout. This was survival. James's eyes lingered on the man's face, weathered, defeated, with a kind of quiet dignity that hadn't been entirely worn away. His fingers trembled, not just from cold, but from something deeper. Shame, maybe, or exhaustion, maybe both. James turned and walked back inside. Behind the counter, he brewed a fresh pot of coffee, strong, dark roast. He moved to the deli case and made a turkey sandwich, piling it a little heavier than usual. From his locker in the back room, he grabbed an old fleece jacket, navy blue, worn soft from years of early shifts and late walks home. He hadn't worn it in a while, but it still held the scent of detergent and memories of better mornings. At the register, he rang up every item, paid with his debit card, and printed the receipt like he would for any other customer. There were no cameras at the back door, but he didn't care. The man was still there when James returned, having made little progress with the plastic wrapper. James approached slowly, holding the tray of items like an offering. "Sir," he said quietly, "thought you might want something warm." The man looked up, startled. For a brief second, James saw suspicion in his eyes, then surprise, and finally something that looked a little like grief. A man who didn't know whether to accept kindness or fear it. I can't pay you, son," the man said, voice rasping like old gravel. "It's already paid for," James replied, placing the items gently on the ground and stepping back. "And the jacket? Take it." "It's cold out tonight." The man reached for the cup with shaking hands. "You're a good kid," he muttered. "Not many like you left." James just nodded, not knowing what to say. As he turned to go, he heard the sound of tires rolling into the parking lot. Headlights swept across the wall. A silver BMW pulled into view, sleek and unmistakable. Perry Stevens. James froze. Of all the nights. The manager stepped out, keys jangling at his hip like a jailer's warning. He scanned the lot, his gaze locking on James and the man beside the dumpster. His eyes narrowed. "What's going on here, Dawson?" Perry barked. James kept his voice steady. "Just taking my break, sir." Perry's eyes dropped to the sandwich, the steaming coffee, and then the jacket. His voice hardened. "You gave him food from the store?" James nodded slowly, feeling sweat bead down his spine. "I paid for it," he said, holding up the receipt. "It's from my break allowance." "We don't serve his kind here," Perry snapped, ignoring the receipt. "You know the rules." "Gee, wasn't asking for anything," James said, jaw tightening. "He was eating from the trash." "That's not your call to make," Perry growled. "You're here to run a register, not play charity." The man didn't speak. He simply looked at James, sad, hollow-eyed, but calm. He picked up the sandwich, then the jacket, and slowly, reverently slipped it on. "You gave him food?" Perry repeated, louder now. James didn't flinch. "Yes." Perry didn't hesitate. "Then you're fired. Finish your shift and don't come back." He slapped a termination form onto the counter when they went back inside, eyes burning with righteous indignation. As Perry stormed out, no one spoke. Only the old man remained, holding the coffee like a sacred offering. He looked at James, something unreadable flickering behind his tired eyes. Then, just before he stepped back into the dark, he straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and gave a perfect military salute, and vanished into the night. The hours that followed dragged with unbearable weight. Every tick of the second hand on the wall clock seemed amplified, each minute stretching endlessly under the heavy silence that now filled the quick stop. James stood behind the counter, no longer an employee in spirit, only finishing his shift out of sheer decency. No one had spoken to him since Perry left. Even the night felt quieter, as if the world had paused to absorb what had just happened. James wasn't angry, not really. If anything, he was calm. Dearly so. There was a strange peace in knowing you'd done the right thing, even when it cost you something. He had no illusions about what came next. There'd be no appeal, no apology, just a final paycheck in the mail and a file in some HR drawer that marked him terminated for policy violation. Around 5:30 a.m., when the sky began shifting from indigo to gray, James cleaned out his small locker in the back room. A folded copy of the New Yorker with yellowed edges, a pocket notebook filled with scribbles and ideas, a pen that hadn't worked in months but he kept anyway. Memory tokens from the version of himself he'd almost forgotten. He paused when he picked up the fleece jacket, the same one he'd given away just hours earlier. It wasn't there. And that's when it hit him again. The old man, the way he'd stood straighter, more dignified once the jacket was on. The salute, crisp, perfect, unmistakably military. And then something else surfaced in James's mind, something he hadn't registered fully at the time. A bracelet, simple, metallic, worn on the man's right wrist. James had noticed it when helping him into the jacket. A flat strip of steel, dull with age, but engraved. He hadn't been able to read the full text in the dark, but he remembered two things. USMC, United States Marine Corps, 1983, Jart H. Followed by letters that faded into shadows. His chest tightened. It had looked almost exactly like the one his grandfather used to wear, a relic from his own time in the Marines. James hadn't seen another like it in years. They weren't issued to just anyone. Usually, those bracelets marked personal loss. Brothers in arms, friends who didn't make it home. The weight of what had happened began to settle in a different way now, not just about being fired, but the growing realization that the man he had helped might have been much more than he appeared. One line from that night clung to James like a fog. I used to wear a uniform. Now all I have left is my dignity. At the time, it had struck James as tragic, but now it felt like a riddle. Or worse, a warning, a farewell. And one more thing he remembered as he locked the empty locker and turned to leave for the last time. When he had asked the man's name, he hadn't given one. He had simply said, "Just remember, I'm still alive because of you." By 6:00 a.m., James stepped into the soft dawn light, feeling more exhausted than he'd ever been. The air was cool and indifferent. He slid into his car, letting the engine idle, while he stared out at the now empty parking lot, where everything had changed. His phone buzzed. A message from HR. Termination confirmed due to violation of company policy. The final paycheck will be mailed within 7 business days. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. No signature, no humanity, just procedure. James stared at the message, reading it 3 times. He didn't expect anything different. But the impersonal tone stung in a way he hadn't anticipated, like all his choices had been reduced to a checkbox. Like decency had no line item on the form. Later that morning, his roommate Ryan blinked at him over a cereal bowl. "You got fired for giving someone a sandwich." James nodded, brushing crumbs from the table. "Dude, that's insane." "It was against policy," James said with a shrug. "Who cares? It's a gas station sandwich, not national security." James cracked a dry smile. "Try telling that to Perry. You should fight it." James shook his head. "Not worth it. I'll figure something out." And he meant it. That same day, by early evening, he had applied to 7 different positions, anything that paid. A temporary warehouse gig came through before nightfall, graveyard shift, loading trucks. Less money than Quick Stop, but enough to keep the lights on and ramen in the cupboard. But what James didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that somewhere, not far from that cold warehouse floor, a ripple had started. Someone else had taken an interest. A simple act of kindness had quietly lit a fuse. And soon that fuse would reach the powder. By late afternoon, James had already settled into the first phase of reinvention, acceptance without bitterness. He focused on logistics, updating resumes, checking job boards, and preparing mentally for a midnight shift at a warehouse across town. His life had been reduced to motions and momentum. There was no time for reflection, not yet. But outside the orbit of his quiet resolve, the world had begun to shift. Around 3:00 p.m., a woman in her early 50s stepped into the Quick Stop where James had been fired just hours earlier. Dressed in a navy pantsuit, her posture was deliberate, calm, and unmistakably official. She made few observations, asked a single question about James's whereabouts, and left behind a business card. No name, no title, only a phone number and a small emblem embossed in the corner, a symbol worn by warriors, the Marine Corps insignia. The current employee on duty, a curious young woman who had recently taken over James's shift, found the card unsettling in its simplicity. She brought it to the assistant manager, who, sensing something unusual, reviewed the surveillance footage from the night before. What had once seemed like an ordinary act of human kindness now took on an entirely different tone. In one frame, just before the old man disappeared from view, he appeared completely transformed. Standing tall, squared shoulders, arm raised in a precise, practiced salute. The implications landed with eerie clarity. Whoever that man was, he didn't just know military bearing, he embodied it. Within the hour, whispers turned into escalations. The district manager was notified. The footage was forwarded up the chain. By early evening, the Quick Stop, which had once been barely noticed by corporate leadership, was now under quiet but serious review. Meanwhile, James had completed orientation at the warehouse, signed new hire paperwork, and received his first schedule. Exhausted but steady, he started driving home, rehearsing how he would break the news to his landlord about late rent. That's when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative, and offered no explanations. The call came from someone representing Veterans Affairs, requesting a meeting the next morning. The nature of the call was classified as sensitive. Confused, James agreed, uncertain what role he had played in something large enough to attract federal attention. The rest of the evening moved like a surreal current. Messages flooded in, some from coworkers, others from numbers he didn't recognize. The manager who had replaced James on shift reported an influx of strange inquiries, including calls from individuals who introduced themselves not by name, but by rank. Something was happening, something far beyond sandwiches and store policies. As the sun set and James prepared for his first night at the new job, a dark SUV pulled up to his apartment complex. A man in civilian clothes stepped out, presenting military credentials and a request. The details were vague, but the request was firm. Postpone the warehouse shift. Transportation was arranged. The matter, he was told, was of importance to national interests. During the drive through the darkened streets of Tampa, James asked a few questions. Even if he had, the answers were not yet his to receive. All that became clear was that someone had noticed what he did. And whoever that old man was, whoever James had stood beside in the shadows behind a gas station dumpster, he was not just a stranger in need. He was someone whose absence had been felt by many, someone whose reappearance now sent shockwaves through systems that rarely stirred for anything. James, unknowingly, had become the center of a story much larger than himself. The next morning unfolded like a scene from a world James had never expected to enter. At precisely 9:00 a.m., 6 military Humvees rolled into the parking lot of the Quick Stop, their engines rumbling like a storm against the quiet rhythm of everyday life. Customers froze mid-pump, phones raised instinctively to record the surreal procession. Within moments, the parking lot was no longer a place for late-night snacks and coffee. It had become an impromptu command post. From the lead vehicle stepped a man in full Marine Corps dress uniform. Every inch of him reflected decades of service. Rows of ribbons lined his chest, polished shoes struck the pavement with precision, and his expression bore the weight of command. He entered the store without hesitation, seeking answers, not directions. In a back office hastily cleared for the purpose, the district manager sat alongside the corporate executives, summoned on short notice after word reached headquarters of an unusual military presence at one of their locations. They were joined by Perry Stevens, now visibly shaken and stripped of the confidence he once wielded with unchecked authority. The tension in the room was thick with unease and unspoken questions. Seated at the head of the table, the Marine officer, identified only by his bars and his bearing, wasted no time with introductions. A tablet was placed before the executives. Security footage began to play. They watched in silence as James approached the man by the dumpster and offered food, coffee, and a fleece jacket. They saw the refusal, the policy quoted like gospel, and the quiet confrontation that followed. What none of them expected was the revelation that came next. The man in the footage, the one Perry had deemed undesirable, the one dismissed as another forgotten figure on society's margins, was identified as Major General Harvey L. Brennan, once the commanding officer of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade. A highly decorated veteran, Brennan had suffered a traumatic brain injury during an overseas operation 3 years earlier. After a prolonged recovery and eventual medical retirement, he had quietly disappeared from his care facility 6 weeks prior. All efforts to locate him had failed, until James Dawson offered him a sandwich. No one in the room spoke for several long seconds. The reality of what had been lost and what had been found settled like a heavy fog. The general's condition had deteriorated due to years of battling post-traumatic stress and memory lapses, and yet he had retained enough awareness to test something fundamental, whether the world still remembered the humanity of those who had once worn the uniform. James was brought into the room shortly afterward, unaware of the full scope of the events he had triggered. He entered quietly, wearing the same clothes from the day before, his posture humble, his eyes still uncertain of why he had been called here. Seated beside him was a tall, older man, now clean-shaven and dressed in civilian attire. Though the layers of grime were gone, the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. This was General Brennan, his presence dignified, though still weathered by time and trauma. He had requested to be there, not to reprimand, but to acknowledge. The executives, stunned by the gravity of the situation, attempted to recover their footing. Apologies were offered, explanations given, and policies re-examined. But words were no longer sufficient. The officer leading the meeting reminded them, without anger but with quiet power, that kindness had achieved what weeks of military tracking and official resources had not. What James had done, in a single moment of empathy, had brought home someone who mattered, not only to the military, but to a nation that had promised not to forget men like Brennan. James was offered his job back within minutes. But more than that, he was offered a different role, one with purpose. A new initiative was proposed, one that would support veterans across the company's locations. James, with his calm resolve and clear sense of humanity, was asked to lead it. By midday, word had spread beyond Tampa. Media vans lined the street outside the Quick Stop, capturing footage of a modest young man receiving a civilian service medal, pinned on his chest in front of a growing crowd. The citation described his act as one of extraordinary compassion and service to the United States Marine Corps. Though cameras flashed and microphones hovered, James stood awkwardly, almost unsure of how to accept gratitude that came in such grand public form. Off to the side, Perry remained still, his expression frozen. His once firm belief in policy over people now dissolved in the face of something he couldn't dismiss. He had fired a man for choosing decency, and the world had taken notice. Later that day, General Brennan approached James in private. He spoke not with command, but with sincerity. He shared what James had suspected, the truth of what he had endured, the reasons he had disappeared, the darkness he had tried to survive. What he had sought was not shelter, but affirmation, that even stripped of rank and recognition, he was still seen as human. And in a cold alley behind a gas station, someone had answered that question without knowing it was being asked. By the end of the day, the quick stop bore little resemblance to the unremarkable gas station it had been just 24 hours earlier. What began as corporate damage control quickly evolved into something more genuine and more enduring. The executives, initially eager to manage optics, found themselves confronted by something far more powerful than brand reputation, a collective moral reckoning, and at the heart of it stood James Dawson. He declined the offer to return to his old position behind the counter. The fluorescent lights, the endless coffee refills, the transactional monotony, it no longer fit. Instead, he accepted a newly created role, coordinator for a veteran support initiative launched by the company in response to what had unfolded. What began as a single program location was immediately expanded into a multi-site pilot. Tampa would be the starting point. The Quick Stop was rebranded as Veteran Stop, not just in name but in spirit. The corner where cigarette ads once hung was transformed into a dedicated space for veterans. There, service members past and present could gather for free coffee, conversation, and connection. Information kiosks were installed and linked to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Volunteer counselors staffed the space 2 days a week, providing guidance, mental health resources, and help navigating benefits long overdue. The fleece jacket James had given away that night was returned to him by General Brennan, but James chose not to take it back. Instead, it was framed behind glass on the coffee wall, an emblem of quiet defiance, of human dignity offered when no one was watching. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "One cup of coffee, one act of kindness, one life remembered." The ripple spread quickly. Within a month, 6 more stores across the city adopted similar models, each with slight differences tailored to local needs. Some focused on employment resources, others partnered with local shelters and VA centers. The initiative James had helped design, one born from a spontaneous gesture behind a dumpster, now served hundreds of veterans each week. For James, the transformation was more than professional. The University of South Florida reached out personally, offering to reinstate his enrollment. A full scholarship was included, along with a message that recognized what he had demonstrated outside the classroom. That storytelling wasn't just about writing, but about witnessing, about responding, about seeing people when no one else does. He returned to his studies with quiet determination, older than many of his classmates but not bitter. He attended lectures during the day and continued to oversee the Veteran Initiative part-time. His days became fuller, no longer shaped by routine survival but by quiet purpose. His voice, once silenced by circumstance, had found new resonance. In a quieter corner of this unfolding story, another shift had begun. Perry Stevens, the manager whose rigid adherence to policy had triggered the cascade of events, faced consequences beyond professional reprimand. Following intense public scrutiny, he was suspended. The company reviewed all managerial conduct across the region, but perhaps most surprising was what followed next. 2 months later, Perry returned, not to reclaim his old role, but to volunteer at Veteran Stop, He came quietly, without press or fanfare. At first, James kept his distance, unsure whether the change was genuine, but over time, something softened. Perry showed up every week, pouring coffee, stocking supplies, and listening. He did not try to justify the past. He simply served, quietly, steadily. It was not redemption through words, but through consistent, unglamorous effort. And in that effort, respect slowly grew, not just from James, but from the veterans who saw in him a man trying to unlearn, trying to make amends. One afternoon, after cleaning up the coffee corner, Perry confessed that decades in retail had taught him about efficiency and profit, but nothing about people. Policies had once made him feel secure, as if rules could prevent chaos. What he now understood was that rules without empathy become fences, barriers to the very things that matter. Beyond the store walls, the story found its way into unexpected places. A local seventh grader who had witnessed James's firing while buying a soda before school created an art project for a county competition. His piece depicted James half in gas station uniform, half in military dress blues, beneath the caption, "Heroes don't always wear uniforms." It won first place. Veterans who had once isolated themselves began returning, not for handouts, but for something much harder to find: dignity without condition, coffee without judgment, a place to be seen. The ripples had become waves. At the center of it, James remained the same quiet presence. No podium, no spotlight, just steady hands refilling cups, checking inventory, and offering something rarely found in fluorescent-lit spaces: hope. 6 months had passed since that cold night behind the quick stop, and the world James once moved through quietly had shifted beneath his feet. What began as a spontaneous decision, a simple offering of warmth and food to a man in need, had become the seed of something far-reaching, something both visible and deeply personal. James was back in college now, attending classes at the University of South Florida. He walked the campus with a different sense of purpose than before, no longer burdened by questions of whether his life had value. His tuition, once an insurmountable obstacle, had been covered in full by a special scholarship, one established in his name by a coalition of veteran organizations and donors who saw in him the embodiment of the values they hoped to preserve. Though the classrooms had changed and his schedule was full, James continued to visit the veterans' stop each week. He remained involved in the program he had helped build, not because he was required to, but because it anchored him. It reminded him that small things mattered: hot coffee, a warm chair, a place to be heard. The coffee corner had become something of a sanctuary for many. Veterans dropped by to chat, sometimes to open up about burdens they hadn't spoken aloud in years. Volunteers greeted them with no agenda, just presence. The framed jacket still hung near the doorway, a quiet sentinel, and beside it, a rotating display of letters and photographs sent in from families, fellow veterans, and students inspired by the story they had heard online or in classrooms. News coverage had faded with time, as all stories eventually do, but the effect had not. Across Tampa, the Veteran Stop Initiative had grown into a network of safe spaces. What once required corporate approval now carried its own momentum, its own purpose. In neighborhoods where nothing much had changed in years, kindness had carved new traditions. The transformation extended even to Perry Stevens. Though he no longer worked in management, he had found a new kind of fulfillment in service. His presence at the store shifted from obligation to calling, and over time, he became one of the program's most dedicated volunteers. The man who once clung to policy now spoke quietly with those who had faced far harsher rules, the kind written in blood and memory. Teachers had begun to assign the story in classrooms. It sparked essays, art projects, and conversations about what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when there was no applause. One middle school teacher described how students who had never spoken in class were moved to share stories about kindness they had witnessed or given. The tale had traveled far beyond the parking lot where it began. On the first anniversary of the event, James received a quiet email. It was from General Brennan, now thriving in a specialized treatment program that focused on long-term recovery for veterans with trauma conditions. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen war, loss, and 1,000 kinds of silence. The general spoke of memory, how some things fade, but others remain. He reflected on the moment James had chosen to act, not knowing who he was, not expecting anything in return. That single moment, he wrote, had reminded him of something he feared he had lost forever, the belief that dignity could survive anonymity. He ended the message with a line that James would remember for the rest of his life, that kindness was not a transaction, nor a performance, it was a recognition, a choice to see someone fully, even when the world has chosen to look away. James sat with those words for a long time. Later that day, as he passed through the veteran stop on his way home from class, he noticed a young Marine lingering near the coffee machine. The man looked tired, unsure, out of place. His uniform was clean, but his eyes held something else. An internal battle still being fought. Without hesitation, James poured him a cup of coffee. He motioned toward the corner table, the one by the wall where the jacket hung. The Marine nodded once and sat down. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. And so the circle continued. There would be no headlines this time, no cameras or salutes, only the quiet rhythm of one man reaching across the gap to another, in a place that now existed because someone once believed a sandwich, a cup of coffee, and a moment of dignity could change a life. Sometimes, that's all it takes.